My husband called me replaceable on a quiet afternoon that looked exactly like every other afternoon of my married life. The sun was slanting through the living room window, landing softly on the carpet I had vacuumed that morning. The house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and coffee gone cold. Nothing about the moment warned me that something irreversible was about to happen. We weren't fighting. That's the part people never expect. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no raised voices trembling with emotion. He said it casually, almost lazily, the way someone comments on the weather or traffic. Replaceable. As if he were stating a simple fact, not delivering a verdict.
"You should be careful," he said, still looking at his phone. "You're not the only woman in the world. People can be replaced."
The word hovered between us. It didn't rush at me, it didn't stab or scream. It simply settled into my chest and stayed there, heavy and undeniable. I waited for my body to react, for my heart to race, for tears to blur my vision, for anger to rise and demand a response. None of that happened. Instead, I felt something colder, something far more unsettling. A silence opened inside me, deep, calm, and final. In that silence, I understood something with terrifying clarity. He had been thinking this for a long time. You don't casually call someone replaceable unless you've already rehearsed the idea. Unless you've already tested how it feels to imagine a life without them. Unless you've already decided they are optional. I nodded. That was my response, just a small, polite nod, the kind I'd mastered over years of swallowing my reactions. He didn't notice. He never did. He walked out of the room moments later, conversation concluded, confident he'd won whatever invisible argument had just taken place. I stayed where I was, standing very still, listening to the sound of his footsteps fade down the hallway. The house felt different then, larger, emptier, as if it had exhaled after holding its breath for years. That was the day I stopped trying to save my marriage. But endings like this don't announce themselves. They begin quietly, in private, inside a woman who finally realizes that love should not require self-erasure. I had been married for 20 years. 20 years of shared routines, shared responsibilities, shared sacrifices. Or at least, that's how I'd described it to myself. I had built my life around his needs so gradually that I didn't notice when my own disappeared. I told myself that compromise was maturity, that patience was strength, that loyalty meant staying even when staying hurt. I told myself a lot of things that made survival easier. Looking back now, I see how carefully my world had been reduced. My opinions softened to avoid conflict. My ambitions postponed because the timing was never right. My exhaustion dismissed as overreaction. My contributions expected but never acknowledged. I had become essential in function and invisible in value. The word replaceable peeled that truth open. That night, we went to bed at the same time. He fell asleep quickly, the way people do when they are certain of their position in the world. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to his breathing. Each inhale and exhale felt like a metronome counting down something I couldn't yet name. I didn't cry. I didn't feel dramatic. I felt awake. Over the next few weeks, I became a quiet observer of my own life. I watched the way he spoke to me, not cruelly, not angrily, just indifferently. I noticed how often my presence was treated as background noise. I noticed how easily he made plans that didn't include me, decisions that didn't require my input, assumptions that didn't consider my feelings. And I noticed something else too. He was no longer careful. Phones left face up. Texts answered in hurried fragments. Sudden work dinners that didn't quite make sense. Compliments directed outward. Admiration reserved for people who weren't me. I didn't confront him. Confrontation requires hope. I no longer had any. Instead, I started preparing. Not loudly, not obviously. I opened a separate email account. I gathered documents. I learned how our finances actually worked, not the version I'd been told, but the reality. I began to understand the quiet power of information, the way clarity sharpens resolve. It wasn't revenge that motivated me, it was dignity. The affair revealed itself not through drama, but through carelessness. A hotel confirmation email left open on a shared device. 2 names, 1 room. A date he had told me he'd be travelling for work. I felt an unexpected sense of calm, almost relief. The kind that comes when confusion finally collapses into truth. That night, as he slept beside me, I realised something crucial. I was not losing him. I was getting myself back. From that point on, every step I took was deliberate. I consulted a lawyer in a quiet office that smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. I learned what 20 years of marriage meant on paper. I learned what patience could buy if applied correctly. I learned that the woman I had been, the accommodating one, the forgiving one, the endlessly understanding one, had underestimated herself for far too long. When I finally asked for a divorce, he laughed. He actually laughed. He told me I was being emotional, that I'd regret it, that I didn't know how hard life would be without him. He told me I wasn't young anymore, that I wasn't special, that women like me didn't start over successfully. "You're replaceable," he said again, slower this time. "Don't forget that." I didn't argue. The day I signed the papers, I felt lighter than I had in years. The document was thin, unremarkable, yet it carried the weight of 2 decades. As I walked out of the courthouse, cold air rushed against my face, and for the first time in a very long time, it felt like freedom instead of punishment. Within minutes, I made the call. Every supplementary credit card under his control, cancelled. Cards he had given to his family, cards his mistress had been using, cards that represented access he no longer deserved. At that exact moment, he was finalising plans for a lavish engagement party. $75,000. A celebration built on my silence. And then came the sentence that stopped everything. "Sir," the planner said, "your payment methods have been declined." The silence that followed wasn't embarrassment. It was panic. The phone rang less than 10 minutes later. I watched it light up on the kitchen counter, his name pulsing on the screen like an accusation. I didn't answer. I already knew what his voice would sound like, sharp at first, then confused, then angry. I knew the sequence because I had lived inside it for years, absorbing his emotions so he never had to sit with them himself. The second call came immediately after, then a third, then messages one after another, stacking into a frantic monologue I had no interest in hearing. "What did you do? Answer your phone. This isn't funny. You had no right." I made myself a cup of tea. I remember noticing how steady my hands were as I poured the water, how calm my breathing felt. For the first time, I was not reacting. I was choosing. When I finally answered, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I simply let the silence stretch long enough for him to feel it. "You embarrassed me," he said finally, his voice tight. "Do you have any idea where I am right now?"
"Yes," I replied. "I do." That was when the panic surfaced. The carefully constructed confidence he had worn for years cracked, and beneath it was a man who had never imagined consequences applying to him. He told me I was being vindictive, that I was ruining his future, that this wasn't how adults handled things. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I spoke calmly. "You told me I was replaceable," I said. "So I replaced myself." He didn't understand what that meant yet. He would. In the days that followed, reality began to catch up with him in small, humiliating ways. Accounts frozen, access revoked, questions he couldn't answer without me, systems he didn't understand because he'd never bothered to learn them. I had managed the invisible architecture of our life for years, and now it was collapsing under the weight of his assumption that it would always just work. His family called, first politely, then urgently, then angrily. They asked why their cards weren't working, why payments were being declined, why things had suddenly changed. I explained, once. "I'm no longer responsible," I said. "You'll need to speak to him." They didn't like that answer. They were used to me smoothing things over, making adjustments, filling gaps. They were not prepared for the version of me that had stepped out of the background. Neither was he. He came to the house one evening without warning, stood in the doorway, eyes scanning the room as if looking for the woman who used to live there. I could see confusion on his face. Not grief, confusion. As though a familiar appliance had stopped working and he couldn't figure out why. "You've changed," he said. "Yes," I replied. "That was the point." He tried to negotiate, then to intimidate, then to guilt me. He reminded me of our history, our shared memories, the life we had built. He spoke as though those things belonged to him alone. I let him talk. When he finally stopped, waiting for my response, I said the only thing that mattered. "You called me replaceable," I repeated. "You don't get to be surprised when I take you at your word." He left without another argument. There was nothing left to say. Life after that unfolded quietly. No dramatic celebrations, no instant happiness, just space. Space to breathe, to think, to exist without shrinking. I moved through my days differently. I noticed things I'd ignored before. The sound of my own laughter, the comfort of silence, the relief of not being constantly evaluated. The woman I was becoming felt unfamiliar, but not frightening. She was steadier, clearer, less willing to negotiate her worth. I ran into mutual friends who didn't know what to say. Some avoided eye contact, others offered awkward sympathy. A few asked what I could have done differently, what mistakes I'd made. I realised then how deeply conditioned we are to ask women to explain the damage done to them. I stopped explaining. Months passed. His new life didn't unfold the way he'd imagined. The mistress became a mirror, reflecting back the same entitlement, the same dissatisfaction. Without me managing the emotional labour, the logistics, the quiet sacrifices, he struggled. He always had. I'd just been carrying the weight for him. One afternoon, I saw him again by chance. He looked older, tired, smaller somehow. The certainty that had once wrapped around him like armor was gone. He asked how I was doing. I smiled, not out of cruelty, not out of pride, but out of peace. "I'm doing very well," I said. He hesitated, then, quietly, "I didn't think you'd actually leave."
That was the moment I understood everything. Replaceable had never been about me. It had been about his fear of being left. That sentence stayed with me long after he walked away. "I didn't think you'd actually leave." It wasn't regret. It wasn't remorse. It was disbelief. The kind that comes when someone realizes the world they took for granted no longer exists. And as I watched him disappear into the crowd, I felt no urge to correct him, to reassure him, or to soften the truth. He was right. He hadn't thought I would leave because for years I had trained him not to worry about that. I had stayed through indifference, through dismissal, through the slow erosion of intimacy that masquerades as routine. I had stayed because I believed endurance was love, because I believed history was obligation, because I believed that being chosen once meant I would always be chosen again. I was wrong. Leaving didn't happen all at once. It happened in stages, quietly, internally, long before I packed a single box. It happened the first time I stopped apologizing for my feelings, the first time I didn't rush to explain myself, the first time I let silence exist without rushing to fill it. Freedom doesn't arrive dramatically. It arrives subtly, in moments you don't recognize as victories until much later. Like the first morning I woke up and didn't feel dread. Like the first decision I made without considering whether it would inconvenience someone else. Like the first time I realized I didn't miss him. I missed the version of myself I had been before I learned how small I was expected to be. People asked if I was angry, if I wanted revenge, if I felt satisfied watching his life unravel. The truth was simpler than that. I felt done. Done negotiating my worth. Done explaining my pain. Done shrinking so someone else could feel tall. I rebuilt my life slowly, deliberately. Not as a reaction to him, but as a return to myself. I learned what I liked again. Not what was practical. Not what was efficient. Not what was approved. What felt right. I filled my home with things chosen intentionally. Music I loved, silence I respected, peace I protected. There were hard days, of course. Healing is not linear, and strength does not mean immunity to grief. Some nights, memories surfaced unexpectedly. Moments that had once felt safe, now revealed as fragile illusions. I let myself feel them without judgment, without rushing to assign meaning. I learned that closure doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from acceptance. Months turned into a year. My life expanded in ways I hadn't anticipated. New routines, new confidence, a deeper relationship with myself than I had ever known. I no longer measured my value by someone else's attention. I no longer feared being alone. Loneliness, I discovered, had never lived in solitude. It had lived in a marriage where I was unseen. One evening, as I sat alone on my porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, I thought back to that afternoon in the kitchen. The moment the word replaceable had been spoken so casually, so confidently, I understood now why it had changed everything. Because it stripped away the illusion I had been clinging to. It forced me to confront the truth that staying had been costing me more than leaving ever would. Being called replaceable was not the insult he thought it was. It was an invitation. An invitation to step out of a role I had outgrown. An invitation to reclaim the parts of myself I had abandoned. An invitation to stop proving my worth to someone determined not to see it. I didn't become colder. I didn't become cruel. I became clear, and clarity is powerful. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. The moment someone tells you that you are replaceable, believe them. Not because it's true, but because it reveals how little they understand your value. The right response is not to argue, is to walk away and become irreplaceable to yourself. That was the day I changed everything, not because he said the word, but because I finally stopped accepting it.